Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are once again going to be continuing with the educational speedrun series.
Zooming through the game with a bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Night on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey hey, he's smurfing play by play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, eagles meet defeat, just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
Now before we jump right into the games, I want to talk just a little bit about openings and why we learned them. Now first and foremost, you do not want to get cheese where you lose a game due to the scholar's checkmate, also known as the 4-move checkmate. But additionally, one of the biggest concepts is the pawn structure and the piece play around that. Now the reason I bring this up is because before we jump into the games, we're going to start with an example played by my very good friend, the poker legend Phil Gordon, who goes by the username of Phil No Limits on chess.com. Now Phil in this case is playing against a 1392 player here. He has the black pieces also in the same range at 1359. Game starts with the move e4. Phil plays the move c6, and now we get the move e5. Now normally of course white would play this move d4 here, and after d5 we get the standard Caro-Kann. But when we get this move pawn to e5, Phil naturally plays the move d5. Very natural, you push the pawn and you open up the scope for the bishop on the diagonal. Now the reason I mention this is specifically because after d5 and pawn takes pawn, in this position Phil plays the move pawn takes pawn. Now there is nothing wrong with this move whatsoever, but the reason I'm showing this example is because in this position I would actually recommend that Phil play the move queen takes pawn. Now you're probably thinking, well, why play that? It's not the best move, doesn't make sense. But the reason is because first of all, we can't play like computers, but secondarily the development becomes very similar to the Caro-Kann, because after white plays a move like knight to f3, you go bishop to f5. Let's just say white plays d4, e6, I'll just say bishop e2, knight f6 castles, and you can play a move like bishop to e7 or even queen c7 with the idea of bishop d6, but this has the pawn structure of a Caro-Kann. Now this is also very similar to Scandinavian as well, but the reason that I'm showing this specifically is because here after pawn takes and we get the move pawn takes, pawn to d4, Phil plays knight f6, we get c3, and now we have the move bishop f5. Now these moves are completely fine, but the difference here is that when we get to this position after pawn to d5, we have now reached a pawn structure that is nothing like the Caro-Kann whatsoever. Now this is actually very similar to an e4 e5 pawn structure. For example, say you get e4 e5, you can have a move like knight to f3. One example is the Berlin defense. After castles you get takes, not d4, sorry, you get rook to e1, knight d6, here, ignore the moves, don't really matter that much. Something like takes, you get d4, d6, rook e1, something like this, for example, to illustrate the point, where you get the same pawn structure of the three pawns. Now white of course could try to play c3, but regardless, this is a structure that is not native to the Caro-Kann system. You can also get it out of e4 e5, knight f3, knight f6, something like this, takes, d4, d5, and at some point something like knight d2, takes, bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, and something like c6 and c3. Now again, the pawn structure is very important because when you learn openings at the start, that dictates the piece play and where your pieces belong. So now back to this game that Phil plays here, we get c6, e5, d5 takes. If white were to play a traditional Caro-Kann, say d4, d5, knight c3, after takes, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop g6, let's just say knight f3 and e6, for example. You can also play knight d7, but just to illustrate the point, something like knight d7, c3, e6, you'll notice the development is very similar. You get this pawn structure like could have occurred in the game had Phil played the move queen takes d6. But anyway, we'll show the actual game for a little bit just to talk about one more important point as it relates to the pawn structure here, which is that we get this position after knight d2. Now if Phil were someone who played the Petrov's defense with knight to f6 or even these Berlin systems, he would no doubt know that the best move here is to play f5 over protecting this horse in the center. Again, this is an idea you can only know if you play the Petrov defense. Now of course, if you're above a certain rating level, you'll be able to figure this out anyway, because when you played so many games, these sorts of concepts become very much second nature. But in this case, Phil did not know this concept, so he trades. Game was actually quite balanced and he eventually would go on to win in a very fine fashion. But this is why you try to learn openings and specific pawn structures. This is also why I oftentimes, when people play the Caro-Kann, I try to suggest that if they want to add a second opening, they play the Scandinavian, because again, you get a lot of positions, or queen a5, sorry, I should say, where you have the same pawn structure similar to the Caro-Kann with these four pawns on these squares. So that's my little introductory bit. Big shout out to Phil. I know he's a big fan of the channel. I know his kids are as well. So just want to give a big shout out to him. And now we are going to continue with a couple of games. So let's get going. I'm going to hit the play button. Off we go. So first game today, we're going to be playing with the black pieces. My opponent plays e4. And now in honor, let's play the Caro-Kann in honor of Phil. We started the video showing one of his games. Let's play c6. We get knight to f3. And now I go d5. So I'm playing the move d5 here. We get the move pawn to e5. And now I have a couple of options. I can play either bishop to f5 or bishop to g4. I think in this position, the move that I'm going to play is I'm going to play bishop to f5. Bishop g4 is also fine. But the reason I'm not going to play that move is because in most Caro-Kann systems, the bishop goes to f5. Maybe the two knight system with knight to c3, you can put the bishop on g4, but other than this one specific system, there are almost no systems where the bishop goes there. So to further reinforce the point of where the bishop belongs in the Caro-Kann, I am going to put the bishop on f5. So we're waiting for a move here from my opponent. Let's see what we get. White probably should play the move d4. We get the move knight d4. Now knight d4 is a very tricky move, and here I'm gonna have to veer off the path of following the basics in this situation, because what I would probably normally play here is the move bishop to g6. This is not a common idea. That being said, you know what, I also kind of want to punish him, so I am going to play bishop g6. Now my idea here is to play c5 to kick the knight. Most likely he's going to push this pawn to e6, because otherwise I would push my pawn and open up the diagonal for the bishop. But let's see what we get. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I also want to punish my opponent. Now he doesn't play the right move. He goes queen to f3, and this is also why it's important to have some general understanding of the openings, because when my opponent plays these moves like knight to d4, these are aimless moves. Yes, it attacks the bishop, but unless you understand a concept to further reinforce the point, it's just going to end up becoming a bad move. So I'm going to go e6, of course, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. Now we've created a perfect setup. Bishop is outside of this pawn chain. It's not on the c8 d7 diagonal. It's gotten out, so the pawns are good. Now both bishops are completely active, and here I have a very good position. Additionally, when you look at this position, you'll notice that everything is very guarded here. The pawns are guarded, the bishop is well placed. My opponent plays move bishop d3. Logical move. Now the problem for my opponent here is that he has this knight and this bishop. They're on d4 and d3, and this bishop on c1 is actually very passive. It does not have scope on either diagonal here. Now I'm going to play the move c5, very thematic move, attacking the horse on d4, and I also want to potentially put my knight on c6 later on. Let's see what we get here. My opponent is thinking, and now he plays move knight e6. Now this is simply a blunder. I take the horse, I'll take back the pawn, and at this point I'm simply up a piece. Now at the beginner level, that doesn't mean this game is over. The big issue for me here is that you'll notice I have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 pieces that have not been developed yet. So even though I have the extra piece here, I need to be very fast with my development. So you got to move queen g4. Now there are many ways to play this position, but what I'm going to do here is I could move the king to f7, but then there are ideas like queen f3. So I'm simply going to give up this pawn. But the reason I'm so overprotective of this pawn on e6 is that this pawn is the base of the pawn chain. Base meaning the pawn that's furthest back that guards everything else. So for example, if I had a pawn on c4, you would notice I have a chain of 3 pawns, but the base is the one that guards everything at the start. So I decided to guard this pawn. Now if white were to take on g6, I would slide the queen over, offering the trade of the queens. Instead we get d3. I will go here anyway, just to protect both of these pawns from being captured. And now the goal is to start developing the knights and get the king out of the center. We get queen a4. That's a spite check. I'll play knight c6 here, developing the knight. It's guarded by the pawn and potentially pressuring the pawn on e5 later on. We get queen to b5, and now I have a couple of options. Now the move that I'm going to play here is very simple. I'm going to castle my king. Reason behind castling the king here is that my king on c8 guards the pawn on b7 here. So now I've finished the development on the queen side. We get this move d4. I just take here. Everything is guarded. Pawn on c5 guarded, pawn on b7 guarded. So I'm following all the basic themes. Now my opponent plays queen c5. I take the queen here, and my opponent chooses to resign. Let's go ahead, next game, and let's keep the show going. So I have white in the second game, and now this time I'm going to play e4. Now in our last speedrun video, I played the Vienna to great effect. I don't kind of want to keep playing the same openings over and over. So now we're going to go back to some basics. I'm going to play the move knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5. Now, as I've said before, e4, e5, they're very limited options when you're playing with the white side. I think the Vienna with knight c3 and g3 is good, and the Scotch are probably my two mains. You can play the Ruy Lopez as well, but I think playing the Ruy Lopez is a little bit too much for a complete beginner. The other option besides playing the Scotch here is playing the 4 knight. So I think let's go for something different. I'm going to play the move knight c3. My opponent goes d6, and now I play the move d4, and at this point both the diagonals are open for my bishops, and my position is looking very promising. We're waiting for a move, and here my opponent plays bishop g4. Now this move is actually an excellent move that I kind of overlooked in this position. I forgot he could play bishop g4. I was kind of expecting him to trade everything off on d4, but this is very tricky because now the knight is pinned and the pawn on d4 is under attack. So here, let's think about this. Now, again, I need to keep in mind this is for beginners at the very base level. This is not about intermediate or advanced, at least not yet. We will slowly get there over time as we play more and more games. But since this is at the complete beginner level, what I'm going to play here is I'm simply going to go pawn to d5. Now, the reason I'm going to play this move is I attack the horse, but I also avoid any threats on d4. We get knight d4. If I take, I lose my queen. So let's go bishop to e3. My queen guards the pawn and the knight here. I have to take with the pawn. And at this point, the material is still balanced, but now I have a slightly compromised pawn structure on the king side. So because I have a compromised pawn structure on the king side here, I need to think about my king. And how do I finish the development of the king? Now, when I look at this position, one thing that's very important about double pawns, one pawn on top of the other one, is that it does generally create a situation where there is an open file. In this case, this is the open G file. So with the compromised structure, I'm not going to castle this way, but I can also go rook to g1 now and use the file, which therefore means I want to castle my king to the queen side. Now, I'd love to play a move like queen d2 and castle, but if I go queen d2, I will hang this pawn on f3. So now that I know that I'm not castling kingside, I'm going to play the move bishop to e2, simply guarding the pawn and preparing to put the queen on either d2 or d3 and castling the king. Get knight to f6, and now I'm going to play the move queen d2. And the reason I'm going to play queen d2 is that for a lot of people, when you play chess, most of your learning is going to be subconscious, going to be your brain sort of connecting the dots and the patterns, especially as it relates to middle games. Openings to some level you can do memorization, but as it relates to middle games and where the pieces belong, a lot of that is sort of subconscious. Now, when you do try to castle kingside and you've played an e4 opening, especially when you get a structure with e4 and f3 and a bishop on e3 like this, almost always if you're castling queenside, the queen is going to belong on d2. Now, after the game, I'll show you guys an example from the Sicilian and from the modern of where you get the structure of e4 f3. You put the bishop on this e3 square, and then you develop the queen and castle to the queen side. So now my opponent goes queen d7, and here I'm going to castle to the queen side, get my king out of the center. I finished my development pretty much. I still have the rook on h1 that's not in the game yet, but at this point I'm doing very well, and my opponent has all these pieces that aren't developed yet. Now, black could try to copy me and castle queenside, but with these bishops spying towards the queen side here, that would be a little bit scary. So you got to move pawn to c6. Now, this move is actually questionable. The main reason this move is questionable is when you look at the position, black has not finished his development. You have 4 pieces underdeveloped, and when you're underdeveloped, you don't really want to try to open up the center of the board the way that my opponent does, because when you're behind the way that he is, this gives me more chances to attack. It's still going to take 1-2 or 1 move to castle the king. So this king is very much in dire straits, and following that basic logic of your opponent's underdeveloped and trying to open up the center, you want to open up, you want to explode the center of the board here to try to take advantage of the lack of development. So I'm going to take on c6 here. This now opens up the d file for my queen and my rook, and he takes with the queen. Now, bishop to b5 is a move that would win the game. This is a basic flash tactic where the knight guards the bishop and the queen gets stuck, but I want to try to follow the theme of taking advantage of development. So what I'm going to play here is this move rook g1. Now, this move is not a standard move, but the reason I'm going to play this move is that now if black tries to move the bishop and castle the king here to the king side, I simply take the pawn on g7. So this also completes my development. It's the last move of the sequence. All my pieces have now moved off their original squares, and here my opponent castles queenside. So now I'm going to go for the move knight to b5. My bishop guards the knight, and here I have some very, very serious threats towards the pawn on a7, and very quickly, as we're about to find out, my opponent is going to lose the game. So my opponent plays move king to b8 here. And now there are a couple of ways to take advantage and win. Now the most obvious one is to take the pawn on a7 with the bishop or the knight, but here in this situation I have the very nasty move queen to a5, where now my queen attacks the rook, and I'm attacking this pawn on a7 as well, and at this point the game is over. Now this is a theme that you will see a lot when you do get a bishop aiming towards, usually it's the king side, not the queen side. It's a very common idea to bring a queen to the king side to attack. Here we get queen to a6, and now I go queen takes rook, checkmate. Now we're going to go into it here. So the first thing I want to show you guys about this game is that if your opponent plays a Sicilian, and I'm not advocating that you play the open Sicilian like this, but one of the common setups here is that you get this situation where you have these 3 pawns, and once again you end up with the bishop on e3. So you get this mini box here with the bishop on e3, and when your opponent castles or plays knight c6, whatever it might be, you always go queen to d2 and castle to the king side. So keep this in mind, because when you get the structure of the pawns with a bishop in this box here, if you want to go queenside, generally you want to put the queen on d2. Now the other example that I'm going to show you guys here is that after the move e4, black can play d6, d4. You get a modern setup. Just to illustrate it, you get something like bishop e3, knight f6, f3. Let's say black castles, and once again you'll notice that you have this box of 3, and here you also go queen to d2, intending to castle the king to the queen side. So generally the moral of the story is when you get these 2 pawns like this on f3 and e4 with this bishop here, if you're looking to castle queenside, the queen generally does belong on d2. So now to illustrate it in real time back into the game here, you'll notice that in this position it's a little bit different because there isn't a pawn on g2, but I have the same set of pawns with the bishop on e3, and now I go queen d2 to castle. Now the relevance is not so much that it's like a wow move or anything of that nature, but your brain, if you're watching this video, you should start to internalize that these things do exist in terms of where pieces belong, because the brain subconsciously is putting 2 and 2 together. So that's the first point that I want to make. Now the next point that I was going to make is that in this position, when I play queen to a5 with the bishop and the queen attacking the pawn, this is a very common theme, but usually it's a mirror and it's reversed to the king side. So a good example is an opening like the French, just to illustrate this. Actually, I'll show you guys a game that I played recently from Title Tuesday, or close to it, where what happened was my opponent played knight c6, knight f3. We got something like this. I played knight c2, bishop d3. I think he played bishop d7, castles, g3. What did he play here? I think he played like a6. And I think I played rook e1. There's some like knight b4 maybe, or was it knight a7? This was a very recent game, but actually let's not get too deep in the weeds. Let's say knight b4. Knight b4 takes, and now you play something like knight g5. Now it's a little bit different, of course, but still very similar. I'm just going to move the knight to e7 to illustrate the point here, where you'll notice there's a bishop on d3, there's a knight on g5 spying the pawn, and now you go queen to h5, and very quickly there's a big attack on the king side. So to show you guys the first example, you see here there's a bishop, a knight, and the queen attacking. But if we look at this one, it's the exact same thing. It's just shifted to the other side of the board, where I have a knight, a bishop, and a queen attacking this pawn on a7. So it's something to keep in mind if you get a bishop on e3 spying a pawn where your opponent castles, or the example that I just gave with the French, just to show you guys once again, where you get this position. Whoops, didn't mean to play that. Where you get takes knight h5, where again it's the same thing. If you have a bishop on the diagonal spying towards the king, or on e3 spying towards the king on the queen side, if you can get a queen on h5 or a5 combined with a bishop, it's very, very powerful. So I think we have time for one more game, so let's start a new game, and here we go. Final one of the day. I have the white pieces, and this time I think I'll play e4 one last game. I think in my next video I'm going to start switching over to d4 more frequently. We got the move knight to c6. Now, a couple moves that you can play here. If your opponent plays knight c6, the most obvious move is pawn to d4, but I'm going to work under the assumption that even though my opponent is a beginner, he knows this Nimzovich opening with d4 and d5, which is not what you want to face. So I'm going to play the move knight to f3. Now black can play e5 and transpose back into a Spanish or an Italian, but what you do by playing knight to f3 is you dodge this d5 move, which is not something I think that generally you want to face. Even for myself, it's not a system that I think white has anything clear in terms of an advantage, so knight f3 is generally considered to be a little bit easier. So we get to move pawn to e5. Now again, I'm going to go knight to c3, bringing the knights out. My idea is simply to play d4, opening up the center of the board on the next turn. We get bishop c5. Now this move is a mistake, and this is one of the great things about bringing these knights out early, is that here pretty much black has to play the move knight to f6, because if you go bishop b4, I have knight d5 attacking the bishop. Actually, I'll show that after the game. And if black plays bishop c5, now I can go for this temporary knight sack, and I'm going to play d4 to fork the bishop and the knight, and I'm a little bit ahead in development, but once again, I'm opening up the diagonals for the bishop. Now, there are openings like the Vienna where you do fianchetto the bishop, but in general at the beginner level, I think one of the biggest things you should focus on is the development of the bishops on their traditional diagonals, combined with pushing your pawns to e4 and d4. Now, of course, that's easier said than done if you are not a 1e4 player and you play d4 on the first move. These sorts of positions won't occur, but for those of you guys who do play 1e4, this is one of the biggest things is paying attention to the development of the bishops, combined with the knights in the center when possible. So we have a position where the material is even. My opponent plays d6 here, and now I could play the move f4, which would probably be quite strong, but we're going to follow the basic rules here, which is that I'm a little bit ahead in development. So what I want to do is I'm going to play the move bishop to f4, pressuring this knight on e5 here, and intending to castle my king to the queenside. Now we get the move knight to c6. I could take the pawn, which would probably win the game, but for themes that doesn't have much value, so let's drop the queen back to d2. You'll also notice, similar to one of the earlier games, the queen and the bishop are guarding each other, and I still intend to castle my king. So now my opponent has a tough decision. Does he want to move his knight to e7 or f6 and castle, or does he want to move the bishop and the queen and castle the queenside? Ultimately, we get knight f6, and now I'm going to castle my king to the queenside. Now we'll see here, will my opponent go the other way? That's really a bummer. Maybe I should have played the move f3 to guard this pawn, so we won't get this, but I will take the knight here. This is a little bit disappointing. We get castles, and here I will play the move bishop to d3. Now when I put the bishop on d3, I'm actually trying to scope this diagonal. Again, very similar to the previous white game here. The knight and the bishop start to go for a very quick attack. That is really disappointing, because I was hoping we'd get a slightly more competitive game, and now we get the move h6. Now what I'm going to play here is a move that is probably very rare. Generally, these concepts only exist with opposite side castling, I would say, where I'm going to play this move pawn to h4. Now this is what the famous streamer Forsen called the fish hook, where you dangle the bait with this pony on g5, because after I take, now I have an open file to try and checkmate the king. Now this is a concept that pretty much only exists with opposite side castling, does not exist in most cases. We get bishop g4 attacking my rook, and now I'm going to go f3, simply attacking his bishop. So let's see what my opponent chooses to play in this position. We're waiting for a move. He goes bishop e6, and now I'm simply going to play the move rook to h4, intending to go for the double stack and aiming for the checkmate on h8. Now, if my opponent were really clever, he might bring this king to e7 and d7. I think that's asking a lot here at the beginner level, but black probably is okay. We get king f8. That is a good move. Now I'm going to play rook h7 here. Maybe I should have done it right away, because after king e7 I can take the pawn. Probably I should have just put the rook on h7 instantly. It was a slight mistake by me, but we get the move g6. Now after the move g6, what I want to do is, I'm seeing that this king is very open. You'll notice this king is trying to run and scurry to the other side of the board to get away. So what I need to do is try and prevent that from happening. So the move that I'm going to play here is rook to e1. Now the reason I'm playing this move is to over pressure on the e file. If black moves the bishop, the king can't escape. If the king goes to e7 right away, there probably are multiple ways to win, but I need to be very quick, very accurate here, because if I'm not accurate, bad things will happen. So we get king g8. Now this is a very bad move, I think, because here I can go rook to h1, and now I've achieved the dream with the double stack threatening to checkmate in 2 moves. The only move I think to not lose immediately is king f8 again. Let's see if we get that move or not. It's the only move to not lose. Actually, I just realized maybe the move I should have played was queen c3 to sack the rook, because after takes I would have had a checkmate in the corner pocket. At any rate, we get rook to e7, and now I can simply go check, and I checkmate with rook to h7. Now again, this is all about the themes of pattern recognition. This is not something you'll see that frequently, at least in this way, where it's vertically versus side to side, but we're waiting for the move here. You won't see this that frequently, I will say, but I'll show you a couple of other examples in a second. Now, two rooks connected, whether it's like this up and down or side to side, generally is very, very effective, especially if there is an open file like there is in this case. So just keep in mind that if you can connect the towers on an open file, whether it's up and down or side to side, which I'll show you in a second, they are very, very powerful when they're connected. Now, my opponent is thinking here. I guess he's maybe stalling. I hope he's not stalling out. He could be. Let's see what we get. I really hope he's not stalling out, or that'd be a little bit of a disappointment in this case. But if he is, there isn't much that I can necessarily do about that. So I guess one of the downsides to speedrun at this level is that someone can actually just sit there and wait. Okay, he does actually he abandons the game, which means that he disconnects from the site. Now, the things I want to mention about this, first things first, let's figure this out, is so the first things first I want to point out is this concept of the fish hook, where you dangle the bait, which is the knight on g5 to be captured. It almost rarely happens with same side castling. One of the more common examples is with the bishop, just to show you guys another one, which is you get this classic exchange Spanish with takes, castles, bishop g4, white plays something like h3, and now black can play the move h5, where black creates the hook with the bishop on g4, which can be captured. Now, it's generally very bad to capture the bishop because after takes, knight takes e5, and queen h4, it's already spaghetti time. Black threatens checkmate in one with queen to h1 here. And if you push the pawn after g3, both checkmate on h2 and h1 are simply unstoppable. Now, that being said, these ideas with the fish hook are very rare to be played. It's only going to happen when there's opposite side castling, and more specifically when you have a rook on the open file. Otherwise, it won't exist. But still, it is a concept you should be aware of, because if you're in a game and suddenly your opponent hangs a piece like this, if you've seen it before, you'll be aware of it and you'll think twice before you automatically capture the knight. So that was the first thing I want to point out. Now, the next thing I want to point out about the rooks being connected is, in this case, you'll notice that after check, king g7 and rook h7, this is checkmate with the rooks connecting up and down. But even if you can get the rooks from side to side, this is also very strong. I guess I'll just set this up. Something like this. It's the same thing where the rooks are connected, but instead of being on top of each other on this file, they're side to side here. And if you can get a position like this where the rooks are connected and you have a king on the back rank with the ability to check the king, the two rooks become really, really powerful. Now, the last point that I'm gonna make is in this game, if my opponent had not blundered with the move knight takes e4, hanging a knight, say castles, the way that you would proceed here is to play f3, creating the same structure of the pawns. The bishop's on f4 versus being on e3, like in the previous game here. But still, even with the bishop on f4, you protect the pawn on e4 with this move. But additionally, you also prepare to play g4, h4, and start pushing the pawns up the king side. Now, this alone is not enough to win the game, but just to show you a sample line, something like h4, bishop b7, g5, knight d7, h5, say we get knight b6. Here you can play a move like g6. Now, I don't remember if this theme showed up in one of the earlier speedrun games. I think it did actually, but there are situations where you're attacking your opponent's king, and after takes, what you would love to do is play this move h6 so that the file is not open here. But in this case, white can simply take, sack the bishop, and you go very quickly for a checkmate. Now, as I said, this alone is not enough to win, but understanding what the idea is here of pushing the pawns and starting to attack is very important. It's also worth noting that this f3 move, very, very important here, because f3 guards, but it also supports the pawn thrust, where now both these pawns on e4 and g4 are guarded by this pawn on f3. So that's going to do it for today's video of the educational speedrun. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below. And once again, a big shout out to Phil No Limits for that great game of Blitz that he played, which served as an educational example. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you very soon. Have a good one. Bye.